Hello, travelers. Welcome to Oceans Week at Reach the World. My name is Tim, and for over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens. This week, in partnership with the Explorers Club and in collaboration with ocean advocates around the world, we're sharing kid-friendly stories of ocean exploration, conservation, and wonder with members of our global community. You can find a complete calendar of live stream events and much more at athome.reachtheworld.org. Joining us today is Explorers Club member Dr. Charles Rawlings. Dr. Rawlings is passionate about something that many people have seen, but most of us know little about, and that's seashells. Dr. Rawlings loves photographing living seashells, and he's here today to tell us all about it. We're also joined today by an on-camera student who's going to ask her questions to Dr. Rawlings. And if you're watching via the live stream today, please use the YouTube chat bar to let us know you're watching. Let us know where you're watching from and what grade you're in. You can also share your questions for Dr. Rawlings in the YouTube chat bar, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the next 45 minutes or so. So without any further ado, it's time to dive into the world of living seashells. Dr. Rawlings, welcome to Reach the World.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. Let me get this stuff up here. And all right, we've got slideshow. And here we go. All right, guys, it is a real honor to be here talking to you guys. I always love speaking to students. In fact, my daughter is a teacher down here in North Carolina, and she helped me sort of get prepped for this, telling me what I should say and what I shouldn't say for you guys. But anyway, like Tim said, almost everyone knows what a seashell is. You've probably held them in your hand. There's probably some in your home. But what people don't know is how they're made and what the animals look like. And yes, indeed, there are living animals that make their home in a seashell. You probably have eaten a living seashell. That would be an oyster or a clam or a mussel or even a snail, perhaps. But anyway, what I'm going to do is show you guys some photos that I took. They're all underwater photos. All of these were taken in their natural habitat. And this is what the living seashells look like. And please, if you guys have any questions at all, there will be plenty of time at the end. Just let me know and I will do my best to answer them. Many times you guys come up with questions that I actually have to think about. But please, no question is dumb. Every question is interesting, and I will do my best to answer them. So anyway, so let's look at some living shells. First, where do you find the shells? Well, the vast majority of seashells are under the water. They're in the ocean. But what people also don't know is that seashells are in the category called mollusks. And mollusks include not only seashells, but they also include sea slugs called nudibranchs. They also include octopus, squid, nautilus, and cuttlefish. And those are all, I'll show you some of the photos of those. So those are all included in mollusk or living mollusk. But here I am, this is me underwater in a big school of fish. This was down in Mexico in Cabo. And to look for seashells, you would be looking for seashells down on the bottom along the rocks. This is sort of a typical living seashell. This is a harp shell. It comes from Mauritius. It's actually a very rare shell. This is the first photograph of the animal living in its natural habitat. Harps themselves are carnivorous. They go out of their way to eat shrimp and crabs and even little fish. And what happens is that this entire animal sort of engulfs what they're eating and sucks it up into their mouth. And yes, indeed, that entire animal will fit in that little seashell. The seashell is about the size of your fist, and the animal here is over a foot long. One of the really cool things about the harps, is if you see the line just towards the back, just under the shell, it looks like someone's cut it with a knife. That's sort of what happens, is if this animal is threatened, it is able to lose its foot. It just drops its foot, and the fish or the octopus or whatever is trying to eat it, eats the foot, and the animal just grows a new one. How long have seashells been with us? They have probably been with us over 500 million years. And saying that, there are anywhere from 80,000 to 100,000 species of mollusks. This is a very interesting fossil ammonite. It's a fossil seashell. It's from about 65 million years ago. It's from the Cretaceous period. I found this in Mallorca, and yes, indeed, the shell has spikes on it to help prevent it from being eaten by marine reptiles such as mosasaurs. Something that looks very similar is the living nautilus. The nautilus is a cephalopod. It's a mollusk. It is indeed a shell. There's a shell on it. Nautilus live in about 1,000 to 2,000 feet of water off the front of the reef. And the way you get photographs like this is you put a large trap down made primarily of chicken wire and PVC pipe. And for some reason, nautilus love chicken necks. And so you put chicken necks in the trap, and there's an opening that the nautilus can come in, but they can't get out. What's also fascinating about these nautilus is that when you bring them up to the surface from the 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet, they're not affected. They don't get the bends. They have a system inside of themselves called, the fancy name is a siphuncle, where they're able to exchange gases, and they do not get the bends. So you can bring them up and photograph them all you want and just let them go, and they go right back down into the depths of the ocean. This is a very primitive seashell. This is called a slit shell. This one is from Bermuda. These slit shells are essentially unchanged for 500 million years ago. They're very, very rare shells. Just to give you an idea, this shell here, if you were a shell collector, you would probably pay about $7,000 for this shell. They live in fairly deep water, anywhere from 500 feet down to 3,000 feet. And the way most of them are collected are 1 or 2 man submersibles and occasionally an ROV. I was lucky enough to have a friend that has an ROV that brought this up so that I was able to photograph it. And this is also the first photograph of this slit shell living. And to give you an idea of how big they are, because you don't really get an idea of their size, this one is about the size of a volleyball, and it was collected in about 700 feet of water. Like I said, mollusks include seashells, squid, cuttlefish, nautilus, and they also include octopus. Octopus are probably the smartest invertebrate on the planet. More and more is being learned about the octopus themselves. In fact, not only does it have one brain in its main body, there's a brain for each one of its 8 legs, so that each leg can do something independent and can be coordinated. This is called the wonderpuss. I photographed this in Ambon. The stripes and the coloration tells you that it's a fairly poisonous octopus. It's also very rare. It doesn't come out very often. And as an underwater photographer, it's a real treat to be able to find one and photograph one of these. This is a pretty typical living seashell. It's a type of seashell called a cowrie. It's a mole cowrie. I photographed this in the Philippines in about 45 feet of water. Typically, seashells come out at night, so I do a lot of my diving during the the dark when it's night. You can see the shell. The shell is the orange yellow with black, and the animal is the polka dot animal with the two tentacles coming out and the proboscis, and we'll see some of those a little later. And the cowrie you may have seen is a very shiny shell, very smooth, shiny shell. And the reason that it's smooth and shiny is because the animal goes over the shell and keeps it shiny like this. This is another type of harp. This is called the Major's harp, and it just gives you another good idea about how big these animals are. The shell, again, is about the size of your fist, and the animal here, if you take it from the proboscis, which is the long thing sticking out of the front, where the two eye tentacles are, all the way back to the back portion, this animal's probably about 2 feet long. I photographed this in Indonesia, in Sulawesi, in Limbe Strait. And the interesting thing here is that this is black sand. It's all volcanic. And this was in about 60 feet of water, if I remember correctly. Not all seashells are big. Some are very, very tiny. In fact, some are categorized as micro seashells. This is a type of shell called an ovulid. It is related to the cowries. This is the tiger ovulid. I photographed this in Ambon in Indonesia. It's about a ½ an inch long. You can see the shell. The shell is just plain yellow right at the top. The animal itself looks like a tiger. It's got the black stripes on the yellow background with the white. And what's really cool is you can see the eye. All of these shells have eyes, and we'll talk about those in just a little bit. This is a living volute. This is from Central America. This was from Honduras. Again, these come out at night. They are extremely carnivorous. The animal hunts moving across the sand, and it typically eats shrimp, other types of shells if you can find them, and even small lobsters. This shell itself is about 3 inches long, so it probably wouldn't be eating lobster, but it will eat shrimp, and that's their main food for this one. I mentioned earlier that mollusks include sea slugs or nudibranchs. This is another fairly rare nudibranch that I filmed in Bali. It's called a doto, or a donut nudibranch. It lives on stinging coral. So the only way to really get in to take a photograph of it is to get stung by the coral. They live pretty deep. This one was in about 100 feet of water. And really the only place you can find them is Bali, is off the coast of Bali. This is another nudibranch. It is much larger than the other one. The little donut nudibranch is about 1 inch long. This one is probably the size of a softball. The really interesting thing about this nudibranch is it's called the solar-powered nudibranch. Not only is it carnivorous, but those structures that you see inside of it are actually algae. And the algae utilize sunlight to provide energy for the solar-powered nudibranch. So you will find these on top of a reef in fairly shallow water because it needs the sunlight to power the algae. Again, a fairly typical shell. This is another, what's known as a volute. This is found in northwestern Australia. In fact, northwestern Australia, I found this in one of the largest tidal regions. The tides in northwest Australia can go up to 25 feet in depth. So in other words, when you've got a low tide, the water goes out at least 2.5 miles. And so what happens is once the water recedes, all of these seashells start popping up out of the sand, and because they go hunt. And once the tide starts coming in, they go back under the sand. interesting with the volutes is usually the animal itself is the same color and have the same pattern as the seashell. This is another type of cowrie. This is called a guttata cowrie. This is one, or used to be one of the rarest shells in the world. And it's one of the really pretty ones. And collectors would pay anywhere $4,000–$5,000 for this particular shell. It's primarily found in the Philippines. You can also find it occasionally in the South China Sea over towards Thailand. This is the first photograph of a living guttata. One of the shell collectors or shell hunters in the Philippines was able to find one. They live in about 200 feet of water and was able to let me photograph it. This was several years ago. These are called flamingo tongues. They are also related to that little tiger ovulid you saw earlier. These are actually mating. Mollusks typically lay eggs. Very rarely do they have living offspring. They typically lay eggs. And the ovulids and the flamingo tongues live on soft coral called gorgonians. And they live on these corals their entire life. And I'll show you a little later that most of these shells take on the color and the configuration of their soft coral for camouflage. And these flamingo tongues, they live in the Caribbean, and actually you can find them as far north as North Carolina and Florida if you find the gorgonians. Like I was talking about, this is another really small ovulid. This is about the size of a pea. You can see it's laid eggs. The eggs are over on the left-hand side. They're little strings in the mucus. You can see the eye, you can see the mouth. And again, it lives on a soft coral bush. It does not move for life, and it takes on the same characteristics, both color and structure, as the soft corals. So the way you find these is you find soft corals and you look in the branches of the soft corals, and occasionally you'll find these small seashells. The soft corals live in areas with high current. So you're usually diving in a current, and they're fairly deep, anywhere from 60 to 90 feet. I like this seashell. It's another cowrie. The shell itself is fairly pretty, but this is one of the very few animals that are red, that don't live in the abyssal ocean. This shell lives on the top of the reef. It lives in and amongst bright corals, and the animal has found that being red and with little protuberances let it remain hidden among the red algae. Again, just to illustrate another small ovulid that has taken on the characteristics of the soft coral that it lives in. Again, these are about the size of a pea, and most collectors of seashells, unless they're very interested in small ovulids, don't really collect these type of shells. This is an interesting shell. These are called leather coral cowries. The shell is pure white with just a little bit of lavender at the front. You can see the lavender there. The animal is black and white. It's black and white polka dotted because it lives on a soft coral that is black and white polka dotted. You can swim over these soft corals, and if you look closely, you can find 6, 8, 10 of these cowries living on the leather coral, but you have to look really closely because they're totally camouflaged. And yeah, if you touch the animal itself, it will retreat and it goes back into the shell. And then you're just left with a white shell on the leather coral, and then that's easy to see. A small ovulid, most people call this the strawberry ovulid, but I took this photo just so that you would be able to see the workings of a typical seashell. You can see the eye, they've got two eyes. There's another eye on the other side. There's the mouth, and then the tentacles coming up. And then the large structure just behind the eye is called the proboscis. And the proboscis acts like our nose. It picks up scents in the water, picks up tastes, and is sort of a sensory mechanism for this type of shell. And again, these little shells, about the size of a pea. This shell is one of the very familiar shells in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is also known as Ceylon. It's the little teardrop island off of India. These shells, not only do they live on reefs, but they live on sand, and they love tidal pools. And in fact, you can see where the water was just surrounding the shell itself. This is part in and part out of a tidal pool. Again, the face of a seashell. This is an olive shell. This is from Mexico, from Cabo. You can see the two eyes. You can see the big proboscis that sticks up. You can see the tentacles, and the animal, the foot, is what causes it to have motion. It's locomotion. These, like many other shells, live under the sand, and they have the proboscis sticking out so that they're able to sample the water. And again, they come out at night typically. I've been showing you eyes, and so we can talk about eyes for a minute. Every seashell has eyes. Some have more than two, and I'll show you that in a minute, like the clams. This is the eye of a conch, the eye of a giant Panamanic conch. The conch you've probably seen, or a type of conch. It's one of the big ones that you can get from Florida. These eyes are the same structure as human eyes. They have tested it in the laboratory, taken photos through the eyes, and what is happening is these conchs are seeing just as well as humans. They see colors, they see shapes. In other words, they see like humans do. So when you're looking at the conch is looking back at you and is seeing you exactly the way you see yourself in a mirror. This is an abalone. And I took this off of Los Angeles, off of Catalina Island. Abalones used to be a huge business because people eat abalones. In the 1960s and early 1970s, there was a huge amount of over-collecting of abalones. And now they're protected. You can't dive and collect them. You can free dive during the season, which is about 2 weeks. And they still are delicious in a seafood section. The Japanese raise them, and they use them for sushi, but they raise them commercially. This is a tropical abalone. The one before was about the size of a dinner plate. This little abalone is about the size of a small saucer. But you can see the animal. It's huge, it's furry, and the holes in the shell allow the animal to breathe. That's where its gills are. This spiky shell is called a murex. You can just barely see the living animal because it doesn't come out much. You can see the eye. The interesting thing about the murex family is that in ancient times, especially the Phoenicians, would use these animals to obtain the royal purple dye that only royalty could wear. They would collect the dye and dye their robes for the royalty. And it was said that one particular island in the Mediterranean off of Italy during the season would just smell so horrible that no one could come near it because there were hundreds of thousands of these murex, and they would let them rot because that's the way you get the royal purple dye. These days, murex actually have medicinal purposes. Many of the murex have antiviral medicines, and some of these murex have been looked at recently for the coronavirus to see if they had antiviral property against them. This is typically what a murex looks like. It doesn't bury itself. It just gets overgrown with all sorts of marine organisms. And murex is about the size of a baseball. What do murex eat? They eat clams and oysters. Any fisherman that raises oysters or clams hate murex because they can come in, will bore a hole in the shell of the clam and suck out the clam itself. Here you see this spiny murex basically finishing off a small clam. I took this photograph in Honduras. Now we come to some even more interesting shells. These are the cone shells. These are the ones that are extremely poisonous. There are about 500 species of cones. This is Conus geographus. There are about five major species of cones that can actually kill a human. Conus geographus is one of them. There have been at least 50 fatalities attributed to this cone. They're big. Some of these get over 8 inches long. They're very aggressive. They don't fear anything. They're out crawling around. And a lot of times they're shallow. People will pick them up. And the proboscis and the mouth, the radula, can actually extend back over the shell and stick the harpoon in the person. Now you're asking yourself, why does a shell need to be poisonous? Well, cone shells eat 3 different things. They either eat fish, they eat other shells, or they eat worms. And you're sitting there going, wait a minute, these are slugs, these are seashells. How do these things eat fish? How do they catch fish? That's where the poison comes in. The poison itself is a type of protein. Chemically, there are like 8 different subsets of the poisons that act on the nerves and the muscles, and Conus geographus acts on the brains of humans, causes them to go demented and put holes in the brains. But anyway, the major type of poison that's injected into the fish immobilizes the fish, paralyzes all the muscles, and stops the fish from even moving. And that takes literally milliseconds. And the shell, the cone, uses a harpoon to stick in the fish. And once the fish is paralyzed, it just reels it in and puts it in its mouth and eats it. This is Conus striatus. Again, this is probably the second most deadly cone. This one I photographed in Hawaii. It's hard to see the size, but this striatus was about 8 inches long and could easily kill a man. This is the textile cone. Again, just like striatus and geographus, it eats fish and it also eats some worms. Its poison is used the same way. But what's also interesting is that the poisons from these cone shells have been used in medicine. There are 2 that have been used extensively. In fact, the FDA approved them back in 2004 to help people with severe pain. Folks that don't want to get addicted to narcotics, people with chronic pain. The types of poisons here block certain parts of the nerves and block the pain channels and block the pain impulses. And so the cone shells actually have a great deal of use in a medicinal area. This is not only a cone, this is probably one of the most famous seashells in the world. In 1798, I believe it was, there were only 5 of these shells known in the entire world. A collector bought one, I believe it was in Germany, so that he could have 2. And what he did was, after he bought it, he immediately smashed it so that there were now only 4 left in the world, and his became much more valuable. This is the first photograph of this cone living. It's called Glory of the Sea. And up until 1969, there were only 50 of these shells around. Then the habitat was found. They're found living under sunken palm trees in the Solomons, in New Guinea, and the Philippines. And now they're rare shells, and you know they will cost $1,000 if it's a nice shell, but there are many more than just 50 around. One last shot of a cone shell. This is what it looks like looking down into the aperture. You can see the two eyes. You can see the proboscis, and that little space between the two eyes is where the harpoon gets shot out and is what sticks into the prey. Many of you guys probably have eaten scallops. What you've eaten in a scallop is the muscle that holds the shell together. This is what a scallop actually looks like. You can just barely see the muscle inside. It's the white square thing that holds the shells together. Scallops typically swim by water locomotion. They jet water out and they swim along the bottom. But that's what a scallop looks like. Many people have eaten oysters. This is what a giant tropical oyster looks like. This one I found and photographed in a wreck, in a World War II wreck in the Philippines. It is the size, it's about the size of a garbage can lid. The interesting thing here is it's hard to see in the photograph, that's because you can't zoom in on it, but this oyster has thousands of eyes. They're just the little eyes that rim the shell, and they're very, very light sensitive. It's not like the conchs, they don't see you, but they're very light sensitive. Everyone's heard of giant clams. There's stories around that these giant clams can trap a diver if you stick your foot in them, and they get huge. They're the biggest, or one of the biggest shells in the world. They can grow up to 3 feet in diameter and probably weigh 500 to 700 pounds. They close quickly, but they can't trap a diver. They don't close that quickly. Like that solar-powered nudibranch we saw earlier, the colors in these giant clams are from the algae. The algae make food for the giant clam. And not only do the clam siphon the water, but the algae provides food for it. We talked about the sea slugs. This is also a very recently discovered nudibranch or sea slug. This is called Shaun the sheep. And if you look at it, you can sort of see Shaun the sheep there. It's green because it eats algae. This little nudibranch is the size of a grain of rice. The way I took this photograph was actually through a magnifying glass. I used a magnifying glass and put it in front of the lens, which was magnifying it also, and got Shaun the sheep's face. And this little nudibranch is only found right off of the coast of Bali, or at least so far, that's only where it's been found. Speaking of poisons, cones are not the only things that are poisonous. Like we saw earlier, octopus can be poisonous. This is the blue ring octopus. There are 5 species of blue rings. They are extremely poisonous. Their poison is called tetrodotoxin. It's the same thing that the puffer fish uses, and it will paralyze a man in about 3 minutes. So if you don't get put on a ventilator, you can't breathe. The good thing about these is that the little blue rings are little. They're small. They're only about 2 or 3 inches big. And it's very tough for them to bite through a wetsuit. In fact, I don't think they can bite through a wetsuit. The reason they have poison is because their main prey are crabs, and they want to stop the crabs before they move, and so they bite them. The poison paralyzes them, and then the octopus eats the crab. This is just a typical reef squid. I thought it was a really cool photo simply because these reef squid have what's known as chromatophores. They're the color cells in their bodies. All the cephalopods do, the octopus do, the squids do, the cuttlefish do, and they can change color based on their mood, based on water temperature, and now it's being shown that they can communicate using and flashing their colors. The little reef squid are only about 1 foot long. These are Humboldt squid. These Humboldt squid are 8 feet in length, and they will eat you. This is one of the first photographs of them being cannibalistic. You can see the one there with his eyes looking back like, oh my Lord, what's happening, is being eaten by another one. I was able to get in the water with the Humboldts off of Baja in the Sea of Baja, and the fishermen there call them the red devils, basically, because they're large enough that they can pull a fisherman overboard and eat them. And there have been reports of fishermen being eaten, and it's from these Humboldts. If people ask me, are you ever scared of sharks? I've been around and photographed all sorts of sharks. The one things that scare me would be the Humboldt squid. This little cephalopod is a cuttlefish. This is probably my favorite organism, my favorite animal in the ocean. It's called a flamboyant cuttlefish. It can change colors from red to green to blue to orange to purple to maroon. It can change its texture. It can go smooth. It can get bumps on it, whatever. But it moves on the sand. It stays on the sand, and it looks like a little rhinoceros just sort of meandering along the sand. The females are about 4 inches long. The males are about 2 inches long. And interestingly, they lay their eggs in empty coconut shells. And so during mating season, if you want to find flamboyant cuttlefish eggs in, say, the Philippines or Indonesia, you dive and look for empty coconut shells. A couple of these next ones are very unusual. They are mollusks. They are seashells. This one is a seashell that looks sort of like a snail. But these are interesting in that these are called pelagic seashells. The way you photograph these, or the way I photograph them, is called blackwater diving. The boat goes offshore probably 10 miles. You can't see land. The bottom is about 25,000 feet below you. You jump off the boat, and there is a buoy with lights extended underneath it down to, I usually put lights at about 30 feet, 60 feet, and 90 feet. And the lights attract all of these weird looking creatures. I mean, really weird looking creatures. You've never seen anything like them before in your life. And I certainly haven't. And I've been diving since 81, I guess. But this is a type of seashell as well. You can see the shell, it's transparent, and then you can see the animal inside of it. This is another seashell. This is called a sea elephant. It does have a shell, but the shell itself is internal. It's the little blue thing at the very top. And again, all of these shells, all of these mollusks are very carnivorous. They will eat whatever they can catch. The little shell before it was about the size of a dime. The sea elephant, is about 3 inches long. This is another type of pelagic seashell. It's called Clavinia. This one's even smaller. This one is about a little less than the size of a dime, but it's very, very quick. In fact, they have been timed at, believe it or not, up to 10 miles an hour in the water. And they're able to latch on and catch all sorts of other little pelagic creatures.
Dr. Rawlings, I hate to interrupt, but we have a bunch of student questions that we want to make sure we pass along to you. If you want to sort of take a minute to wrap up, we can move on to question and answer.
Tim, I believe this is my last slide, actually.
All right, great, perfect.
Yeah. This is a pelagic nudibranch. We've seen like Shaun the sheep and the solar-powered nudibranch. This is a pelagic nudibranch that swims like fish, and it eats jellyfish. It will attack any living jellyfish that it can find. Another photo of the little transparent snail. And then just to wrap it up, this is your typical beautiful seashell. This one is from Sri Lanka, and it's called Illyria. And like I said, this is one of the most beautiful shells I can think of, with the checkerboard, the orange, and the animal itself. So there you are. I'm ready for any questions.
That was just absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Rawlings. Wow, like I am struck by the beauty and the variety, and I have so many questions, but I want to turn it over to Ayana, who's joining us on camera today, and give her a chance to ask you a question, get us started. Go ahead, Ayana.
Tim, you want me to stop sharing this? So we have
yes, please.
Okay.
Please.
There we go. Okay, now that's better.
Hi.
Hi.
One question that I have is, why did you choose to study shells out of all the species in the ocean?
Very good question. Ever since I was 4 or 5 years old, I would walk around the beach and find these shells that had washed up. And I looked out in the ocean and was always wondering, where did they come from? What's underneath the ocean? When I started diving back in 1981, it took me about 2 years to get into photography. And as an underwater photographer, I've taken photos of whales, sharks, abstracts, corals, everything. But I noticed that no one was photographing living seashells. No one really even knew anything about them. And that's where I really started. I think my first living seashell was photographed probably in 1986 or 87. So it was the fact that no one was photographing them, and they're absolutely gorgeous.
Thanks for that great question, Ayana. We'll come back to you in just a minute. I want to grab a question from our live stream audience. We have a whole bunch of them, so I'll try to get to as many as possible. A student is asking, what gives the seashells their different patterns and colors? And I know you touched on that, but is there sort of a general answer across the whole spectrum? It seemed like some of these shells are found in a pretty deep depths, and I wonder if that affects the colors and patterns.
It does. That's actually an interesting question. The animals draw calcium carbonate from the ocean water, and folks have noticed that the shells are patterned primarily on the environment. The color comes from a lot of times the sand that it lives on, or the coral reef substrate. It also comes from the soft corals. They mimic the soft corals, and the chromatophores in the shells are able to genetically take up the color pigments to match their surroundings. So it's primarily their environment that determines the shapes in their structure.
Okay, very interesting. Great question from online. How big can some seashells grow to be? What is, besides the giant clam, is that about as big as it gets?
That is almost as big as it gets. The biggest gastropod, the biggest snail, comes from Australia. It can weigh up to 150 pounds, and it can be 4 feet long. It's found in Northwest Australia, in the same place where the giant tides are.
And it goes all the way down to the shells that are so microscopic you need a magnifying glass just to take their photo.
You got it.
What a range. A student is asking online, is there a way to tell which seashells are poisonous like you would with a snake?
No, not really. You just learn that the cone shells are the ones that are poisonous, and the top 5. Other than that, the shells themselves, the animals aren't going to hurt you. But as long as you know what those 5 cones are, then that's all you need to know.
Okay, very good. Ayana, let's go back to you. Do you have another question you'd like to ask Dr. Rawlings?
Yes, so I looked at your website and it said that you studied some medical stuff. So did you change completely to full time for shells, or do you still do your other careers?
So you looked at my website. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I am a neurosurgeon, and that's why I like the cones. And my specialty is pain. That's one of the reasons I really appreciate the cones. And I'm also an attorney. I do medical malpractice. So, but yeah,
Right.
thanks for looking at my website. I appreciate it. But I do
Very
both
cool.
of those.
That was one of my questions too. How did you get into this? It's a fascinating sort of twist based on some of your other accomplishments you've done in your career. Very, very cool. Let's get to another student question from online. Student is asking online, what is one shell you would want to photograph that you have not yet been able to find?
Yes. My holy grail is called Bednall's volute. It has never been photographed alive. I think it's probably one of the most beautiful shells. It is found primarily in the Tiwi Islands of Australia, in the Arafura Sea. That is the one shell that I want to photograph.
Okay, so everyone who's watching live or is watching this recording, Google it, maybe take a look at least at the shell.
Yeah, it's Bednall's, Bednall''S.
Okay, very interesting. Do you have plans to go in search of the shell at some point?
I do. In fact, I am submitting an Explorers Club grant to do that very thing next year.
Fantastic. Well, good luck with that. We'll want to see that photo when you get it. I'm sure you will. It sort of leads into another student question from online. A student is wondering, how do you take your amazing photos? Is it hard to do while you're underwater? And what kind of equipment do you use?
Okay. First, you've got to be a good diver. Is it difficult? It's more difficult to find the subjects, especially the living shells, because like I said, most of them come out at night. My equipment, I typically use a Nikon. It's an 8100, D8100. It's in a housing, and I use 2 strobes. And my lens is typically a 60 millimeter or 105 millimeter, but it's in a housing, and it's digital, so I get to sort of edit underwater. I get to see what I'm shooting. Versus when I first started, I was shooting with a Nikonus with film, and you only got 36 photos, and you really had to be careful with the exposure and everything else because you couldn't see underwater what you were shooting.
Yeah, wow, I'm sure that's come a long way with digital photography and all. Fantastic. Well, let's see here. Ayana, do you have any questions you'd like to ask? I want to make sure and come back to you if you've got another question. If you do, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
What's your favorite type of shell that you've photographed or seen so far?
My favorite shell is probably that nautilus shell. I think it is so cool to put a trap down and have all these nautilus come up in the trap. They're about this. Some of them are bigger than dinner plates, and they're just so cool to photograph because you get this living animal with the tentacles and this really nice patterned shell, and you dive with them as they're going down the front of the coral reef to photograph. That's probably my favorite. My next favorite are the harp shells, just because the animals are so big and they're patterned so nicely.
All right, Anna, thank you so much for that great question. I have one closing question sort of on the theme of ocean conservation and preservation with Oceans Week. I know people love to collect shells. Are there any concerns about collecting shells or keeping shells, or are the shells just sort of the cast-offs of these living animals, and there are no concerns about collecting shells?
That's a hot topic. True collectors collect living shells because they want the fresh shell. If, just like almost anything, if you are conservative and take one and don't wipe out a colony, that's not a problem. A lot of shell collectors only take dead shells or shells with hermit crabs in them. And then clearly that doesn't have any problem at all with the population. the rare shells really these days are ones that are very difficult to find. They're deep, they're in unexplored areas, things like that. And that's why they're rare. The real problem is not the collecting, because most shell collectors are they're conservationists, in other words. They are not going to go take 200 shells and wipe out a colony. It's the ocean warming, because as the water gets warmer, the shells have a great deal of problem taking out the calcium carbonate, and the shells themselves become thinner. You might remember Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's sort of like that. The eggshells with the DDT are very thin, and the shells of the mollusk are thin because of the calcium carbonate and the ocean warming.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for ending on that note. This has been an absolutely riveting presentation. I could listen to you and see your slides all day long. Glad we got a chance to answer a lot of questions today. Ayana, thank you so much for joining us. To all of our live stream participants, thanks for your great questions and for joining us online. I want to thank you, Dr. Rawlings, for sharing your extensive expertise and those beautiful photographs. This is just the beginning of Reach the World's full lineup of Oceans Week events this week. Later today, we're going to be unlocking the secrets of the Galapagos Islands. And tomorrow, we're going to be diving with sperm whales off Dominica and connecting with Fabian Cousteau to learn more about efforts to protect sea turtles in the Caribbean. So I hope that you'll join us for one of those events. You can check out the complete list of upcoming Oceans Week events at athome.reachtheworld.org. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thank you so much, Dr. Rawlings.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. The questions were awesome. Thanks.